And so here's an Israelite saying, well, everyone knows there was a flood. That's a given. I'm arguing as the reason behind it and the divine purpose. So the difference is between basically incipient polytheism, where the gods are capricious, not all-knowing, backbiting, lying, cheating, versus a God who is in complete control, and the only struggle he has is between, like I keep on saying, justice and mercy. So the difference is in the divine sphere, not the actual event sphere.
Hello and welcome back, you wonderful people. Welcome back to the Buried Bible Podcast. I am Keegan, the layman, normal, average Joe guy, here as always with the sweetest old man I know, Dr. Mark Chavalas.
Listen, this is never scripted. I have no idea what he's ever going to say. So
nobody ever does.
Yeah.
Well, we're excited. We're excited to be back. We're going to continue our series on the flood, and so I'll turn it over right away. We'll dive in. We're going to be looking at some Mesopotamian flood stories. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And disclaimer: we're not claiming to be believers of the Mesopotamian flood stories. I know that's what the title and the thumbnail is going to say. We're just giving background to the Genesis account of the Bible. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
It's the same thing like with demons. Some people were sort of chiding us for talking about demons. I'm actually against demons. I just wanted to make that clear, just in case there was any doubts about it. So the last podcast, I talked about the Mesopotamian flood epics in general, where they're embedded, etc. And there are two main ones. The long one is the Atrahasis epic, which is probably Old Babylonian period. There might be earlier renditions, but we do not have them. And then there is also a one tablet of the long Gilgamesh epic, which has the story of the flood in it, tablet 11, which, by the way, is not in the Old Babylonian period edition of the Gilgamesh epic, but it is later. I don't want to talk about all those details, but it's from the Neo-Assyrian period. So whether or not it was actually with the earlier periods is still impossible to say. And so I'm going to compare those two. And I know that a lot of you out there are probably really interested in talking about how similar the flood epics are. That's not going to be my plan. My plan is to talk about how they're not similar. And there's a couple of reasons for it. First of all, you know, the Mesopotamian version of the flood, the one that is embedded in the Gilgamesh epic, was discovered by George Smith about 80 years before I was born. So that gives us about 150 years since the Mesopotamian versions of the flood story began to be discovered. It's not exactly new news any longer, is really what I'm trying to say, is that it's not new material, it's old material. I don't think it's dusty and old and moldy at this point, but the fact that they have similarities is not exactly new, and that's really what I'm going to bring up. I'm going to start off by reading a quote by Adam Millo, who I did bring up in our last podcast, and this is his really, really smart book, the Gilgamesh Epic in Genesis 1 through 11. He's a Wheaton College professor right now, and a really, really smart guy. And so he talks a lot about the comparisons. And I want to put this in the context of what I've really been doing with a lot of the other traditions, the Babel tradition, in many respects, in its final edition that we have in Genesis 11, certainly is very aware of and responding to Mesopotamian traditions about Babel. I think the same thing is happening with the creation epic, and so it's no surprise that the biblical account of the flood certainly is well aware of the Mesopotamian traditions. But I'm going to keep on saying this until my head falls off. The Israelites are part of the ancient Near Eastern tradition. They're not separate from it. They're not going around looking for really cool stories to write about. there is an overarching ancient Near Eastern tradition about the flood. The Israelites are well aware of it. They have it in their own traditions, but now when they're writing their edition that we have in Genesis 6 through 9, they're doing it from the correct perspective, from the monotheistic perspective, to help you understand. Here's a tradition everyone knows about, the tradition of the flood. Let us give you the correct rendition. It's not as if, and it is chronologically, at least the edition that we have, is chronologically later than the Mesopotamian one. That really shouldn't be a problem. But I want to give you a quote that Adam has. He's on page 95 of his book. And he says, Genesis 6, 9 through 6 bears uncanny resemblance to Mesopotamian flood accounts. This is not surprising. It's strongly suggesting it drew upon these sources when retelling it. This should not be intimidating or bothersome to a Bible-believing Christian. It just shouldn't be. In other words, what I'm trying to do is provide you a context for understanding this text. The commonalities between the Mesopotamian and Israelite traditions are simply too numerous to account for apart from historical contingencies. All right, enough of those 25-cent words, Adam. What do you really mean? For example, both the Gilgamesh epic and the primeval history. By the way, primeval history is what biblical scholars, pointy-headed ones, usually talk about, Genesis 1 through 11, the early stuff before we get to Abraham in chapter 12, or the end of 11, actually. Anyway, so here's the similarities. They trace the fate of one man spared from a divinely ordained deluge. Both men construct large boats of wood, reeds, and pitch, load them with all sorts of animals, and ride the flood waters amidst the flood. Then these boats come to rest on mountaintops, as reconnaissance birds are dispatched 3 times to determine if the land is ready for sustaining human life. When the flood waters have receded, both men provide offerings to the gods. To this remarkably similar plot line, it should also be added that unusual Hebrew words used in Genesis hint at reflexes of Akkadian words. So, for example, Hebrew kofer and kupru is the word for pitch. So they're using words that are probably loan words right at that point. They're not used really anywhere else in Scripture except in this type of context. So this further confirms the influence of Mesopotamian traditions on the flood story in Genesis. All right, now I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to establish all that. Suffice to say, I'm more interested in something else, and I think this is what Adam has helped me with, is that let's look at how they're different, because the similarities ultimately, in my opinion, are superficial. And I think I've said this on almost every single podcast. Israel comes out of a Near Eastern context. The similarities between them and the other guys are superficial. If you would have asked an Israelite, or if you would have made the offhanded mention, your flood stories look just alike, they probably would have just stopped you and said, something like in Yiddish, oy vey, are you kidding? We're about as different as possible. Of course there are similarities because we're talking about the same story. And so the birds, the boat, the guy who was saved, etc. But did you look at the backstory, what's happening up in the heavenly realm, etc.? And there are some superficial similarities even there, but the differences are so dramatic. And so I think what I'm going to do here is read excerpts of the longer flood story first, the Atrahasis story, to provide context for the actual flood itself. Because without this context, I think what scholars have done over the past century and a half have looked at the similarities, and maybe they couldn't get past the similarities to begin with. And by the way, I remember the first time I found them when I was basically a teenage college student. It's like, wow, this just blows my head gasket out of the water. I think that's mixing metaphors. Sorry. Anyway, but whatever it is, like, this is really shocking. How do you figure that? And then I think, and really it's taken me 50 years to try to work through this. Just wait till we get to the law codes. we'll probably spend 50 podcasts on that, or 49, I don't know. And so let me provide context at the beginning of the Atrahasis epic. I think I showed you this book, maybe last one, by Lambert and Millard. Even though this is a little bit dated, it's 50 years old now, it's still a really, really nice edition. You can get this as a PDF file online if you work hard at it, doing your Google search, etc. The Babylonian story of the flood. And though there have been new editions, this is really still a nice user-friendly one to use. Okay, if you want to do scholarship in the area, every Mesopotamian scholar will tell you this is great, but you got to go to Wasserman's book, which I think I showed you last time. So let me just read a couple excerpts out of the Lambert and Millard's one. This is at the beginning of the story. In other words, here's the backdrop for the flood itself, and it shows the gods. I don't know. I suppose they're sort of capricious. They do things unexpectedly, and above all, they're devious and unjust. Okay, and that's the problem I think any Israelite scribe is going to have when they're trying to frame the true account of the flood. Their main goal is going to show that no, the true God, the God of the Bible, is in complete control of all this, although he does have a struggle, which we're going to be talking about. And the struggle that the true God has is that the relationship between his justice and mercy. And how do I work through that? And it, by the way, it's agonizing for God. In fact, it's as agonizing for God as it is for a woman to give birth. The tremendous pain and labor that is described in Genesis 3 that is going to happen to a woman is the same pain that God has when he agonizes over announcing that the flood is going to happen. And we'll get to that point, probably not in this particular episode. So anyway, people were saying I was too wordy. And so, of course, my answer to that was, yeah, right. So here's how the Atrahasis epic starts. When the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much. The seven great Anunnaki, there's that word again, were making the Igigi suffer the work. By the way, sometimes the Anunnaki are the gods in general, and the Igigi are the high ones. This is poetry, and so they're sort of mixing things together here. Anu, their father, was the king. Their counselor was the warrior Enlil. By the way, Anu is the king of the gods, but like I said, he's sort of a CEO emeritus. Enlil is the active head of the pantheon. And this is made clear in other epics. Their chamberlain was Ninurta, and their sheriff was Ennugi. The gods had clasped hands together, had cast lots and divided. Anu went up to heaven, and they gave Enki the prince the bolt of the sea. After Anu had gone up to heaven, Enki had gone down to the Apsu. Okay, in other words, they're portioning off where the gods are supposed to go after all this. And then there's a break in the tablet at this point. The gods are still weary with all the hard labor because they've got to do everything. There aren't any humans anywhere, and so they have to basically dredge the canals. They have to bring the food. And the lower class gods are having to do with this all for the higher class gods. It's sort of reflective of what the earth is like with slave people and royal people, etc. And I'm again convinced that the writer of the Bible in Genesis is addressing that when he's talking about the fact that every single human is made in the divine image and is made for royalty. In other words, to run the earth. And so they're again writing purposely against that. I talked about that 1,000 podcasts ago. So anyway, this was excessive for broken for 40 years. They suffered night and day. Then they started complaining and backbiting, grumbling in the excavation. Let's confront our chamberlain, that's Enlil, that he may relieve us of our heavy work. And Enlil they're going to go to Enlil. But you know what they do is, I'm still in tablet 1. The council of the gods, the hero Enlil, line 58. Come, let us unnerve him in his dwelling. Enlil, the council of the gods, come, let us unnerve him in his dwelling. By the way, this is supposed to be sung. It's poetry. Let's proclaim war. Let us mingle hostilities. And so the gods basically are saying, so if he's not going to listen to us, let's basically attack his temple, the Acor, which is the center of the universe. We're at Nippur. It's the great holy city. And so they start basically laying siege to the Acor, Enlil's dwelling. It was night, halfway through the watch. The temple was surrounded, but the god didn't know it. So Enlil's, happily sleeping inside of his temple, and all of a sudden he's awoken by some of his divine counselors. Remember, there aren't any humans anymore. And Nusku roused his lord. He got him out of his bed. My lord, your temple's surrounded. Battle has come up to your gate. We got to do something about this. Okay. And so Enlil's rather upset about it. Why do you fear your own sons? And so you know what he does? He says, go get dad. In other words, go get the king of the gods, Anu. This is a little above my pay grade. And so they quickly fetch Anu, who comes down. And Anu's thinking, well, what's the problem with these people? He's a little out of touch, evidently. And so this is almost like reading the creation epic from Mesopotamia, which is having the gods doing all their fighting and backbiting and warring. Well, this is no different in this story. And so Anu decides, well, there's something wrong here. Let's see if we can figure out a compromise. By the way, if you're wondering what's happening in the world right now, this is kind of like maybe the stalemate and the government shutdown, except that so far the two parties haven't laid siege to each other, at least not physically yet. So Anu, we're in still tablet 1 around line 174. So Anu opened his mouth. He spoke to his fellow gods. So why are we depreciating them? In other words, he's so out of touch. It's like, so these people, these poor lower class gods have been abused all this time. Why are we doing that? It's like, hey, buddy, it's under your watch. Why haven't you, he's sort of like a do-nothing king or president or whatever. Their corvée labor was heavy and their labor was hard. So he says, well, hey, we got the creatress god, Beled Eli. She's in our midst. Hey, let her fashion something called, we'll call them humankind, so it can bear the labor of the god. Then Ea opened his mouth. He said to his fellow gods, hey, I'm going to prepare a bath for purification. Now, the only way to do this is to slaughter a god. So we're going to slaughter one, let a single god be slaughtered. Thereby the gods will be cleansed by its submersion. Nintu, which is another word for Beled Eli, should mix clay, God and humanity mixed together so that forevermore we hear the heartbeat, a human life force from the flesh of the gods. So they're saying, all right, great. We'll take a deity, we'll slice them up, and from that dead god comes human. This is not unlike the Enuma Elish tradition, which is, by the way, a bit later than this, where a single god is made. And even though the traditions are different, the principle is pretty much the same thing. There's strife in the heavens, and from there, from the gods' complaints, they basically create a situation where the gods can be pacified. All right, that's great. But they didn't think of what this would mean. And so the goddess creates male and female humans. Okay, and that seems fine, except that they procreate and they keep on procreating. And so now we have a problem, which, by the way, Ann Drefkorn Kilmer wrote in an article, is they have a problem called overpopulation. There's just, it doesn't take long. There's just too dang many of them. And they're just, they're procreating like bunnies, and they're all over the earth like flies. There's just way too many of them. And so, in other words, and they haven't created death yet. And so they just created all these human beings, or they're just expanding and expanding, and they're noisy. And by the way, your house is supposed to be a place of repose, and no loud noises, no crying. Babies shouldn't cry, etc. And so this is really going to irk the gods, especially the high gods. So this is now over a long period of time. But you have to have this backstory to know why humans were created. Now there's way too many of them. And so now what do the gods do? Well, let's start getting ways of, let's say, slowing down the population. So here we are in Tablet 3. Let there be a third group of women among the people, the childbearing woman and a barren woman. In other words, we need males who can procreate, we need females who can procreate, and we need females who will be barren. By the way, there's no male counterpart in the Mesopotamian mindset. They just can't imagine a male, even if a male married 10 women and there's no human product coming from their union, the argument would be that the male wasn't the problem. All 10 women were barren, even if they got remarried and would have children with others. They were barren when they were married to that particular person. It just couldn't enter into their mentality that the male might have a problem. Oh, well. So let there be among the people barren woman, and also let there be among the people the Pashitu she-demon, who's a baby-snatching demoness, if I need to use the word for female demon. From the lap of she who bore it, established the Ugbatu high priestess and other high priestesses who are purposely barren. Let them be marked off for the gods as celibate. And so this way we can at least start cutting off childbirth. Okay? Well, that seems okay. How do we do that? Or, how does this work? Well, it's not enough. And so the gods basically pronounced the flood. Okay? And again, I'm not as interested in the details of the flood. I'm interested in how the gods interact and how they deal with this. And so when the flood comes, the gods are a little intimidated by what has happened. In other words, we're going to send the flood, and this is going to stop the overpopulation problem, but it does a little bit more than they expected. It actually removes the human problem. And, oh, wait a minute. If we remove the human problem, we're right back to square one, and that means we're going to have to do all the dirty work again. So they're having a struggle with this. And so, for example, the mother goddess, the one who made the humans, these are her poor little babies. It's like you planning to do something in the future, but then you didn't know how you're going to feel emotionally when you actually got to the precipice of that action itself. It's like, wait a minute, I didn't really think this out emotionally. How am I going to feel when I actually have to go through the process of doing such and such? And so the goddess saw the flood happening and she started weeping. The midwife of the gods, the wise mommy, there's another term for it. It sounds like mommy in English. It's just an accent. We always made fun of that when we were beginning Akkadian students. Let the day grow dim, let it change and become dark. As for me, how was it that in the assembly of the gods I decreed utter annihilations among them? In other words, what was I thinking when I did the vote? It didn't, wait a minute, I voted to destroy humanity. Oh, wait a minute, those are my babies. Why? How could I do that? And you're thinking about this. Can you imagine being a Mesopotamian and this is what you think about your gods? What a pitiful universe it is. At least in the Bible, you have a God who you believe is just, but is all, in fact, the biggest struggle that God has is that between his justice and mercy, which we are going to talk about at some point, because, when God repents or changes his mind, it's not because he has new information up here. Wait a minute, I'm going to do something different because I got new information. It's because he's struggling. When I say struggle, I don't know what that means for God, but he's struggling with justice and mercy. Here, these gods are, since they don't know everything, they don't understand the consequences of their actions. Kind of like, really think about it, the gods are like humans, except maybe 100-fold. And so when they do stupid things, it has a lot bigger consequences. And the gods are kind of like superheroes. I don't know. I think they're kind of like Hancock. The super, what is he? But anyway, I mean, he's a terribly flawed superhero who can do really cool things, but he's got his own personal hangups. The guy was evidently reading Mesopotamian mythology, is all I can say. So she's saying, Enlil goaded me and made me declare it. In other words, it's all Enlil's fault. He's the one who wants to get rid of the humans, and he made me do it. I wish I didn't listen to him. And he confused my words contrary to my character and my nature. I've heeded their solution to the people's noise. It's my fault that the offspring have become like flies, meaning that they're all dead and there's just, to a god, of course, looking down, you're seeing all these little creatures all over the place, and they look like flies upon the water. As for me, it's as if my dwelling is a house of lamentation where noises are silence, as though I were in heaven living in a 50 treasure house. Where did Anu go? The gods, his sons who obeyed the command, who ill-advisedly brought about the flood, consigning the people for devastation. And so she starts wailing. Unfortunately, part of her wailing is broken. But the sea is now like full of dragonflies to fill a river. And so I saw and I wept over them. I ended my lament for them. She wept and in so doing, she calmed her heart. By wailing, she released her emotions. The gods wept with her for the land, the grief that she was sated, yet, and even though she was sated by it, she still thirsted for beer. In other words, she needed beer because that would, of course, dull her senses, and she would help her pain. She sat weeping. They also sat like sheep. They filled the trough. Their lips were chapped with distress. They were unceasingly convulsed from hunger. For 7 days and 7 nights came the downpour, the storm, the flood. The flood happened for 7 days in this particular tradition. And of course, remember that once this happens, unfortunately for the gods, when this happens, there's no, after they're all done, there's nobody to do their hard labor. And so they're going to be back. And of course, not only did they do all this, they have unjustly destroyed the gods. What did humans do wrong? Nothing. They did exactly what their nature was created them to do, is to procreate and be noisy. That's what humans do. And so, again, where did Anu go, who presided over the deliberations? Has Enlil approached the incense? He who did not take counsel sent the flood, consigning the people to destruction. The mouth of the two you issued utter annihilation. Now they're, Baalit Eli, anyway. So at that point, the problem with all this is that the gods are really bothered by this. They start wailing over them as mine. Anu now is all upset. The wailing over them is mine. It's my destiny. Let him come out on this adversity. These flies are like lapis lazuli pendants on my neck. So I remember the days. In other words, the goddess will now put a pendant of flies around her neck to make her remember all those little created beings that she made. These are all my children that I killed by doing this. It's, if you think about it, it's just perverted and bizarre that, I voted to destroy them. Then I feel horrible about it. And now I'm going to have all of their pictures, around my neck, millions of them, by these little fly pendants. In fact, Anne Draftcorn Kilmer and others have tried to connect the flies to when God creates the rainbow, to remember. In other words, every time you see a rainbow, you remember that God promised not to bring a flood any longer. That's the memory for it. Here, for her, I remember the flood every time I look down and see the little flies, my little creatures that, of course, I condemned to death. So it's a real bummer, to say the very least. So what do we do at this point? So that's the reason. So the reason for the flood is, in a sense, overpopulation. The gods just can't get it right. and they're really bummed by it. Of course, there is one single person who survives, and in the Atrahasis story, it's almost immaterial. Enlil is bothered by it. Remember, he's the active head of the pantheon. When you get over to the Gilgamesh tradition, which is, by the way, a much shorter tradition, when it talks about the reason for the flood, it's brief and truncated. Because, of course, in the Gilgamesh story, Gilgamesh has nothing to do with the flood. Gilgamesh is a great adventurer. He's kind of like Achilles. He goes on and does great deeds, hoping to get immortality through his great deeds. When he finds out that immortality won't keep him alive physically, he learns from a barmaid about the man who survived the flood. His name in the Gilgamesh epic is Utnapishtim. He gets an audience with him, and Utnapishtim in Tablet 11 is now going to tell him the story of the flood. And it's quite short, relatively speaking, but it does give us a little bit of understanding of how this works. And so let me get a portion of this. So this is Tablet 11, about verse 8 or so, in the Gilgamesh epic. Again, easy access. If you just put in Gilgamesh epic PDF file, you can probably get this thing online. It's the most famous story in Mesopotamia. In fact, you even have, I think I mentioned this in the last podcast, there are fragments of the Gilgamesh epic found as far away as Anatolia, but also at Megiddo, which was a cuneiform scribal outpost in northern Canaan. So Utnapishtim speaks to Gilgamesh. I'm going to reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a closely guarded secret. I will disclose to you a mystery of the gods. It concerns Shuruppak, which was the city that Utnapishtim came from. It's a well-known city in central Mesopotamia, a city which with you are familiar, a city situated on the banks of the Euphrates. The city was ancient. The gods were in the midst when the great gods desired to send the flood. Now, there's no particular reason that the flood is given in the Gilgamesh story. It's sort of like a given. We know the gods decided to give the flood, at least in the biblical tradition, we're told. Now, the only friend that humans have in this story is Enki/Ea. Enki, by the way, is the Sumerian name. Ea is the Akkadian name. It's kind of like maybe Aphrodite, and Venus. Venus is the Latin name. Aphrodite is the Greek name. We have the same type of traditions in Mesopotamia, and so they're the same deity. But Ea, here's a book by Martin Worthington, who basically wrote an entire book on about 10 verses in the Gilgamesh epic about Ea's duplicity. In other words, here's a god who purposely tricks humans to get them to happily go to the flood. And so Utnapishtim is now telling Gilgamesh about how all of this happens. And if you're wondering about the gods, whether you should believe them about anything, it's pretty frightening here. And so Ea is so in the story, Utnapishtim is now telling the story. This is how the god came to me, Ea. And Ea says, I'm going to save you for the flood, Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim is saying, that's really good, but there's a lot of people around me. What do I tell them? She says, well, because I was told to build a boat, okay, but I can't build a boat by myself, and so I'm going to have all the boat people who build boats and carpenters, etc. I'm going to have them all help me, which is fine, but what do I tell them I'm doing, and why am I doing it? And so, Utnapishtim, you're going to lie to them, and so this is what you tell them. He says, what do I say to the elders of the town when I tell them I'm building a boat? He says, Ea opened his mouth to speak, saying, you'll also say to them as follows. For sure, Enlil has conceived this hatred of me. That's the high god who doesn't like humans. I can't dwell in your city any longer. I can't tread on Enlil's ground. And that's, the Enlil's temple and etc. I'm going to go down to the Apsu to live with Ea, my master. Okay. I'm going to go down there. He's going to rain down on you plenty, but abundance of birds, of fishes, of riches at harvest time. In the morning, he's going to rain down on you bread cakes, and in the evening, a torrent of wheat. In other words, you guys are going to get so much food. You're going to be so happy. It's going to rain cats and dogs. Everything that you want, all the good stuff, you want apples, gold, whatever you want. It's going to be happening soon, but I've got to leave because Enlil hates my guts. I'm going to go with my buddy Ea, and then the opposite. That means so I need a boat to go down there. So you can help me build a boat, and when we're done, you're going to get all this good stuff. And so all my kin and others, I got aboard the boat. I sent aboard animals of the wild, creatures, the wild persons of every skill. Shammah sent me a deadline. That's the sun god. In the morning, he'll rain down bread cakes. In the evening, a torrent of wheat. Get into the boat, seal your hatch, and time arrive. In the morning, he'll rain down bread cakes. In the evening, a torrent of wheat. And I watched the look of the weather. So this is Utnapishtim giving us his firsthand account. The weather was frightening to behold. I went into the boat and sealed my hatch. To the man who sealed the boat, the shipwright Puzur Enlil, I gave the palace together with its good. In other words, as I'm getting in the boat, I'm telling the boatman, hey, you can have all the goods that I have. It's all yours. You can keep it. I don't want it anymore. Well, that's a great deal. So I get in the boat, and of course, then the flood happens. And so all these people who thought they were going to get, wheat and bread cakes and all this good stuff, they get water instead. And so Ea is a big fat jerk so if you think about it, if you're Utnapishtim, it's like, well, this is good for me. It really sucks for you, I guess, if I want to use the modern vernacular, since, of course, I've got kids and grandkids, and so I know what to say. And so Worthington wrote a whole book about this, to show that Ea sort of does this in every epic, that he does something. He does it to Adapa, good old fish man, who's the first of the Apkallu, and tricks him into doing something when he has an audience. And so Ea is worse than Enlil in the sense that he acts like he's a good guy, but he's not at all. And you're thinking, man, if you're wondering how foreign this is really, really different. So, but it gets worse in the Gilgamesh epic at this point, because so the flood happens, and the same thing happens with the goddess. The goddess screamed like a woman in labor. Belit Eli, the melodious voiced one, the days of yore have indeed turned into clay. In other words, humans are just, they don't move anymore. They went back to their original form, clay, because I wrongly spoke among the assembly of the gods. How did I speak so wrongly among the assembly of the gods that I decreed a war to exterminate my people? I bore them, they're my people. They fill the sea like schools of fish. The Anunnaki, those space aliens, they wept with him. The gods sat there in tears. Their lips were swollen and chapped. And then it talks about, again, it's almost copying the Atrahasis epic again, 6 days and 7 nights, etc. So we've got this real bummer of a situation. And she does the same thing with her flies, puts her necklace on. And so there's a clear dependence upon this with that. Let me, never forget these poor creatures that I made. And then they all realize, wait a minute, it's Enlil. He made us do this. And so now when we do our incense, don't invite Enlil. Enlil must not come for the incense offering. This is now line 164 and following, because he was ill-advised in sending the flood and decreed my people destruction. Oh yeah, I agreed with him at the time, but he sort of convinced me. It's like I voted for the bill, but I didn't read it. I was just told just to do it. And so Ea/Enki is now going to go talk to Enlil, so he won't get too upset, because he's going to go up to him and say, hey, buddy, you decreed the flood and they all died except, well, actually one survived. And by the way, Enlil is going to be really upset about this when he finds out that one survived. But the point about this is that the way I can get in his good graces is by telling him that he was wrong about this, but in a very nice way. So Think about it. The gods act just like humans do, except that they're more powerful. And if you have read Greek and Roman mythology, of course, it's pretty much the same thing there, is that the gods they have all the good points of humans and all the bad points of humans, but they're all on steroids. And so it's much more dangerous. So Ea opened his mouth and spoke to Enlil. Oh, most valiant Enlil, you're the Abkalu of the gods. In other words, you're the great sage of sages, a warrior. How could you ill-advisedly send the flood? As for the guilty, punish the wrongdoing. As for the offender, punish his offense. But you could have, if you wanted to reduce population, you could have sent lions, or you could have sent a wolf, or famine, or pestilence. You could have done all that. And so he's trying to butter him up at this point. And if I butter the guy up, maybe he won't be so upset when you find out what happens. Now, what are we going to do now that we have one human and his family left? Well, they're going to start procreating like bunnies again. And so what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? So at this point in the Gilgamesh epic, they decree death. Okay, so Utnapishtim is now telling Gilgamesh, remember, and this is the story within the story, oh, you're wondering why you don't have eternal life? It's because at this point the god said, all right, now that we're starting over again, and I'm really upset that one survived, but now we're going to use him, and they're going to start making humans. We're going to decree death to them. They can't live forever. And so you, Gilgamesh, are looking for eternal life. You're not going to find it. I got a bonus, by the way. Utnapishtim got eternal life just because he got lucky. But everybody else that comes from him, they're not going to get it. You're not going to find the eternal life you seek. When the gods created humanity, they established death for humankind at this point. They have reserved eternal life for themselves. Okay? And the Anunnaki, the great gods were assembled and determined the fate for the gods. And so at this point, that's in other words, if I suppose if you summarize the two flood traditions, humans are sort of unwittingly in the middle of a power struggle between gods. Okay, it's not that different than the Enuma Elish epic. And in the power struggle, of course, we have the decree of the flood. Humans get caught in the crosshairs and they're all destroyed by it. What did they do wrong? They were just acting like humans. The gods are liars. They're unjust. They either feel bad about their decision that they make. And then humanity is now, no, but humanity now understands why they can't live eternally at this point. Now, with all that, as we're nearing the end of this podcast, my next goal is to try to look at the biblical account, not so much to compare the specifics. I know you're going to ask me about them, and I'll do my best to try to deal with it. But my goal is to try to look at the biblical epic in this context, to try to understand the mind of the Israelite God and the struggle that he's going through to work through the same situation. He determines that there's going to be a flood to destroy humanity. Why does he do that? What's the backstory? By the way, the backstory is something we already talked about. It's Genesis 6, 1 through 5. And so I'll have to summarize that at some point. And the struggle that God goes through. What does it mean for him to repent? I'm going to have to get theological for a little while. It's a struggle for me, but, and so like I said, to sum this up, an Israelite is going to look at the same story and give you a completely different backstory, a completely different reason for the flood, a completely different response to it. And if you're wondering what world would I rather live in, it's probably the one where I have a God who's struggling between justice and mercy, which, if you think about it, that's the theme of the entire Bible all the way down to the end, is that God is struggling to find a way to provide mercy to the rebels. That's us. And how does he do it? I'm going to become human myself, and I'm going to take, I'm going to bear the sin of the humans myself. And of course, that's the incarnation. Now, does that anticipate it in Genesis? No, you would have been able to figure it out, but it certainly leaves open for that possibility, which comes to his floret in the New Testament. Whew. All right.
There it is. Well, let's just do a couple questions because I don't want to ask questions that are going to most likely be answered or covered more in the next episode. So with the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, what are dates, timelines?
Okay.
Just for,
yes.
Again, we're getting in the weeds.
The Atrahasis epic, the earliest edition right now looks like the late Old Babylonian period. Maybe it might even spill into the Middle Babylonian Kassite period, but we're dealing with approximately 1600 BC for the edition as it stands. There's no reason to think that it was composed right at that point. In my opinion, and when I talk about this with authorship, there's a stream of tradition. So in other words, there are traditions about Mesopotamian creation stories going back into Sumerian that go heavily into the third millennium and probably even earlier in oral tradition. We just don't have this particular flood story going back that early, but it fits quite well in these creation accounts. And so quite early. The Gilgamesh epic itself is also in its earlier editions Old Babylonian. However, the flood story comes from the library of Ashurbanipal, Neo-Assyrian period, which is approximately 1,000 years later. That would be 700, 600 BC for that. And there's no earlier physical evidence for the Gilgamesh epic being incorporated into the, for the flooded story to be incorporated into the Gilgamesh epic as early as the Old Babylonian period. But that's just because that's what Assyriologists do. If you don't have the actual evidence, then I can speculate, but I'm not going to do any more than speculate about it. So from that standpoint, it's all earlier. There's no doubt about it. The biblical story, as it stands, of course, this is a really tough nut to crack. But even if you argue that it's all Moses all the time and it goes back to Moses, Moses is still later than the Old Babylonian period. He's late Bronze Age, which would be contemporary with the Middle Babylonian Kassite period, and so there's no way the Hebrew story stands on its own. And I'm not arguing that it's dependent on the Babylonian one at all. I'm arguing that they have a common flood tradition that is common to the ancient Near Eastern peoples, and the biblical one is the monotheistic version. In other words, this is their edition, which they consider to be the correct account of the story.
And how many other flood narratives, because these are the two big ones, how many other variations are there?
We have, like I told you, and so go back to the previous podcast that we had, the first one on the flood. We talked a little bit about this. We have a few other fragments of other flood epics. We have the Ark narrative that was made popular by Irving Finkel about 10 years ago in his book about the Ark. And so we have a fragment of a text that is not part of the Gilgamesh epic, and it's not part of the Atrahasis epic. And so we have that. We have a fragment of a Sumerian account, which is also Old Babylonian. And it looks like it might even be a translation from Akkadian, which is really interesting. And so it clearly is a fragment of a flood tradition. And then we have later ones in the Hellenistic period. Berosus talks a little bit about the flood. So it's really, when George Smith found the flood tablet, we shouldn't have been too shocked because we've always had the Berosus account embedded in Jewish and Christian tradition, where he talks about the fact that the Babylonians had a flood story, and it's in relative agreement with in other words, Berosus is a Babylonian scribe. He's looking at cuneiform texts, and so he may very well have had access to either a Sumerian account or the Atrahasis account, and he's sort of summarizing it in his work, which has always been known by classical scholars, by the way. So in terms of chronology, there's no doubt about the fact that the biblical one is later. There's just no doubt.
And since you want to focus on differences, for you, what are the main differences when it comes to these two specifically, Atrahasis and Gilgamesh?
To me, the differences are really, to summarize what I've talked about, is that it's what's happening up in heaven. What's happening up in heaven is completely different. We have gods who are fighting against each other. There's a divine struggle between, really, if you think about it, the divine classes. The lower class gods are upset with their labor. They're going to lay siege to the upper class gods. The compromise is creating humanity, and then the gods decide they have to destroy humanity. But then they, of course, many of the gods who hadn't thought this through are upset about it. And I know on a superficial level that kind of looks like what God does when he repents of his creation, but I'm gonna argue that that's not the case at all. And so the point is, the difference is between basically incipient polytheism, where the gods are capricious, not all-knowing, backbiting, lying, cheating, versus a God who is in complete control, and the only struggle he has is between, like I keep on saying, justice and mercy. And so so the difference is in the divine sphere, not the actual event sphere.
What about for those two compared to each other? Or are they like do you see Gilgamesh as it's just like an expanded or edited version of the Atrahasis? Or is there or do you see significant difference in the same way? Because I think the attack is always, oh, well, the Bible just copies all these other ones, and oh, look at the similarities or look at the differences. But the argument would be we don't do that same comparative analysis amongst other Babylonian traditions themselves, which is, okay, we say we take the Bible against these other ones, but the same thing is happening seemingly, and I don't know if there's a huge difference between those two, but do you see those differences amongst Babylonian and Mesopotamian flood accounts as well, in terms of, we would say, like the Bible, a bit theological messaging against those?
Yeah.
Is there that same amongst Babylonian texts?
Not as much. Here's the problem. Like I said, the two main editions are the ones that really talk about the divine deliberation sphere. However, the Gilgamesh epic is describing it is basically giving you, and if there are any Assyriologists out there, I'm not sure why you're watching, but if you are watching, please bear with me if I say it like this. The Gilgamesh flood story is pretty much like a Reader's Digest account of the Atrahasis one, although it's not completely dependent upon it. But it doesn't talk as much about the deliberations about why the flood is made. It is more interested in the divine response to the flood. And in fact, I remember when I was taking my, I might have mentioned this already, but I'll bring it up again because it was so meaningful to me. I remember when I was taking my Akkadian cuneiform exam, where I had to basically sight read a cuneiform text without any aids. And I started reading it, and I realized, oh, it's getting dark. The land is getting dark, and the water is coming. I realized, I'm reading the flood epic. I know this. I know it by heart. Oh my goodness, I'm saved. I'm going to make it. I start reading that. But the point is that in the Gilgamesh flood tradition, there's no detailed deliberation in heaven about why the flood's coming. It's just sort of a given. It's as if the writer assumes that you know the story, in the same way that if, I don't know, you and I are like, we always talk sports for a few minutes before we start here. It's like, we already know what we're talking about. If he mentions something that's in the news, if I don't know about it, it's like shame on me for not being up on things. He upped me again, or whatever. And so the people reading the Gilgamesh epic, they're well aware of the Atrahasis tradition, or at least the flood tradition. So here is a summary. And so there really isn't a big difference there. Except the fact that that the reason for the flood is completely capricious. There is no reason for it. It's just sort of a given. Mm-hmm. If they were to expand it, maybe they would give you. But think of Atrahasis. Let's say it's a whole book on the flood. The Gilgamesh epic is a chapter that summarizes everything that's here. That's why, for example, when George Smith found the Gilgamesh tablet, and he went back to Nineveh to look for the missing piece, he found the missing piece, but it really wasn't actually. What he found was a fragment, we think, of the Atrahasis epic. And so it was another tradition which we had to try to splice together. That was really not known for a couple of generations until they figured out that what he found was something a little different. But it was talking about the same thing. So they're not that dramatic. It's almost comparing apples to oranges in terms of that.
Okay.
I suppose. But to me, I haven't studied it enough, and maybe it's because of lack of, I've been sort of indifferent to it, is that studying those two traditions, I've been more interested, of course, in taking them, lumping them together, because all those traditions, even though they have some differences, are so dramatically different in their purpose to the biblical one.
Yeah, because I think that's and I just asked that because I think that's the main hang-up again, which is, again, the term copying. We like to throw out, well, the Bible, as if ancient Near Eastern people couldn't come up with their own flood.
Yes.
Well, they had to just copy.
Yeah.
And I guess we can't go an episode without talking about Heiser. But Heiser kind of had that.
Yes.
He had I forget what he was talking about specifically, but would speak to that well, no, these ancient people, it's not that they couldn't come up with, the whole point would be the fact that a real flood does happen, but the purpose or the theology behind it is entirely different. The whole meaning of, okay, how do I take that and then apply it to my life? The biblical narrative versus Mesopotamian ones. Not that, well, see, the flood in the Bible didn't really happen because they just needed a copy. It's like, no, they could have come up with their own. The whole point is, no, a real flood happened. Everybody's aware of this. We're going to give you the truth and the real application and theology behind it because it's a real event.
Yeah.
You've misapplied it and misunderstood who the God is behind it and what the purpose and why it even happened, and then how God resolves it after the fact.
And remember, we've done, I think this is about podcast 35 or 36. I can't remember exactly
Something
what
like
it
that.
is, but long podcast. But this has been my theme in every podcast, is that our goal is to look at the Bible through the lens of the ancient Near East, to try to understand it, its original context, as best we can. And by doing that, we're entering into the mind of an Israelite and finding out that they're basically products of the ancient Near East, except that they stick out like sore thumbs because their view of God, that's the thing that's different. Their understanding of the divine realm and the singular God who has everything under control and is not fighting a war against other creatures. And even those creatures who rebel against him are utterly subdued in every manifestation, and they can only do things that God allows them to do. And of course, that's still a struggle, for us to understand that. That's so for them, they're looking at it like there isn't any other way to look at this. In other words, I suppose it would be like if two of us are completely different in our political ideologies, somebody in 1,000 years is going to look back and he's going to be quite uninterested in the purposes behind it. We're going to find out, but they're talking about the same thing. They're both talking about the same issue, about the government shutdown or the issue of immigration or what to do about, the
tax reform,
the tax or whatever it is, and in 2,000 years they're thinking, well, was there actually a problem with immigration? Was there a problem with tax reform, etc.? And we're looking at each other and saying, well, of course there was. We agree on that. We don't agree on what to do about it is the issue. And so here's an Israelite saying, well, everyone knows there was a flood. That's a given. I'm arguing as the reason behind it and the divine purpose. That's why we're so unique. And here are all the questions that a modern is asking. Wait a minute, we need proof that the flood existed. We don't even, is there historicity behind it, etc. And they're thinking, but that's not my point. If an Israelite, in the same way that in the creation account, they're not giving us an account. They're giving us account of God's orderly creation rather than whether or not, he created it out of nothing or what have you. Their emphasis and their purpose in writing is different than the questions that we're asking, I suppose.
Yeah, and so I guess to set up the biblical, when we go into the biblical narrative of the flood, so do you see in the way that it's written in the Bible that it is explicitly, maybe I guess you'd say taking shots at their narratives or poking holes at the Babylonian version of the
flood? I would
flood?
say implicit. It's really no different than, I know this is later in the story, but we've already looked at the Genesis 11 account of Nimrod and Babel, and clearly I would say there's strong implicit statements showing that they're well aware of the Babylonian tradition, and they're showing where it's lacking in understanding and purpose. And the same thing happens with the flood account. The same thing happens with the creation account. And so all of this, what is called by scholars the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, you can find ancient Near Eastern reference to each of the stories. And the biblical writer, his goal is not simply to write in response to them, because I think I've said this before. It's not as if the Israelite writer, let's say in the 6th century, who's giving us the final edition, is writing this up and then giving it over to his Babylonian scribe colleague. Hey, get a load of this, you knucklehead. Look at how silly, infantile you polytheistic, pagan mindsets are. No, I think he's doing it to encourage his people, because this is, now, by the way, his people aren't reading it, but they're hearing it. Mm-hmm. The term to read in both an Akkadian and Hebrew really is a word that means to cry out. So when I'm saying that you're reading something, it's actually that I'm crying out so you can hear it, because if you don't read or write if you're the average Israelite. And so, and you are, if you're living in Babylon, you are thoroughly immersed in Sin City, as we used to call Las Vegas. And so all about that. I'm giving you the real story to encourage you. It's almost as if I can help purify your mind so you have the correct theological messaging. And so it's not so much to take pot shots at those guys. It's to basically uplift the true believer so they can be encouraged. If you think about it, it's no different than us. If I want to argue against a heretical tradition concerning Christianity, I'm not going to do it by reading all the heretical texts. I'm going to be reading it. I'm going to be doing it by reading the correct biblical text, and then respond by showing, by encouraging you. Here, I'm going to saturate you with the book of Romans, so you're not going to be reading this other heretical text any longer. And so here, I'm going to saturate you with the flood story, with the true account. So all the stuff you've been hearing, all this messaging out here, that's the pagan polytheistic models, you can forget about. But I'm not worried about. But I'm not addressing them directly.
Yeah, so it's not like an outright apologetic. But again, in that defense of the heretical teaching, like what they're doing is you can't give an argument against the heretical teaching without at least touching on the fringe details, or
Yes.
even like sometimes actually mentioning the details,
Yes.
but in the correct way. Because it's just like heresy.
Yeah.
It's not like any of the details or subject matter aren't true. They've just distorted the subject
Yes.
and the detail
Yes.
matters. So of course I have to speak on the same detail matters.
Yes. That's a very good way of putting it, a distortion of the truth.
Okay. Yeah. No, because I think that's like the big wrestle, and kind of wanted to set that up before we go into Genesis, which is, I think most people go, Epic of Gilgamesh, Atrahasis. Well, we know those are false accounts. And so if the Bible is the same and just a copy of it, well, then let's throw out that as well.
Yeah.
But then the argument, which we'll see next episode, is the fact of, again, of course they're using the same details in subject matter. The flood is true, but we're completely different.
Yeah.
Perfect. Got anything else?
I'm good.
That's it. All right. Well, perfect. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, I didn't ask too many specific questions about these things, so if you have more, drop your comments below. Mark will, in his timing and in his snarkiness, respond to you. But yeah, we appreciate you guys. We appreciate your support. And yeah, continue to look out for more details on that live event we got coming up in November 21st, Friday, 6:30 to 8. Otherwise, we hope you all have a great week.
Central time, by the way.
Central time.
Yeah.
Yep. We are in Wisconsin. So we hope you all have a great week. And thank you again for tuning in to the Buried Bible Podcast.